When Monkey Punch debuted the Lupin III manga in 1967, it was a surprise hit, extending what was meant to be a 3-month contract into a series that gained popularity in the late 60s and was a certified hit by the 70s. When the first manga run ended in 1969, Lupin III was one of the most popular comics in Japan, with over 90 chapters released in the country. It would be quite a few years before another Lupin manga began, but its success raised the question, could this manga lend itself to a film adaptation? Apparently, there was some talk of a live-action Lupin film back in the 70s, although evidence on this is sketchy and details on anyone involved are even more so. Besides, for Lupin, an animated adaptation made a little more sense. Although the idea of adult animation is nothing new nowadays, back in the late 60s it was still a novel idea. In America, for instance, the rise of the counterculture and a loosening of social taboos eventually paved the groundwork for adult animated features and shorts. With the rise of animators like Ralph Bakshi and Charles Swenson, the country was suddenly flooded with animated films that were raunchy, violent, and incendiary, and heavily parodic and critical of the Vietnam War and other contemporary events and news stories. Although these movies had backing from several critics and found a dedicated audience, their commercial performance was often mixed and occasionally resulted in verbal or sometimes physical crusades against these movies. It would be a while before adult animation became mainstream in America and the world beyond, but the groundwork was certainly laid out, even if it was a rocky start. It's a similar story in Japan, as around 1969, animation was still generally seen as a medium for children or family stories, and an animated movie or TV show made specifically for adults was seemingly out of the question. That was, of course, until Gisaboru Sugii started reading Lupin III. He was an animation director at the animation studio Tokyo Movie, and his credits to that point included the seminal anime Astro Boy and Goku no Daiboken, one of several anime based on the Chinese novel Journey to the West. He thought that Lupin III would make for a great animated adaptation, and pitched the concept to Tokyo Movie founder Yutaka Fujioka. The business was originally founded as a textile company, believe it or not, but Fujioka soon opened another business focused on filmmaking. That company eventually closed its doors, and Fujioka diverted the textile company to work on animation in 1964, renaming it to Tokyo Movie. Their first animation work was Big X, an adaptation of the manga of the same name written by the legendary manga creator Osamu Tezuka, which lasted from 1964 to 1965, although many of the episodes are now considered lost. Other projects during this time include superhero anime Perman, sports drama series Attack No. 1, and Star of the Giants, and perhaps most notably, an adaptation of Toe Janssen's book series Moomin. Although this isn't the animated version of Moomin that most are familiar with, Tokyo Movie's run was somewhat infamous for taking a bit of a mature tone, which proved popular with audiences in Japan, but which heavily displeased Jansen. As a result, Tokyo Movie lost the contract for the show, and Mushi Productions picked up the series. It was during production on Moomin that Tokyo Movie also began working on a pilot film for Lupin III, after Sugi's proposal was accepted, collaborating with Toho on animation and production. Tokyo Movie wasn't doing very well financially, and they couldn't fund a full-length movie themselves, so they planned to create a 12-minute pilot to gather interest and funding. Monkey Punch himself was involved early on in the pilot film, but he found the project overwhelming and eventually left it in the hands of the animators. For the staff, Tokyo Movie brought in a lot of their heavy hitters. This includes Sugii, who directed the pilot, Moomin director Masaaki Osumi, who oversaw the project and would later be brought on board for Lupin Part 1, Doraemon director Tsutomu Shibayama, who was a character designer and key animator, legendary character designer and animator Yasuo Otsuka, who was also a key animator and whose fascination for drawing machines, particularly cars and guns, proved invaluable on the series, famed jazz musician Norio Maeda, who later became a production manager for a handful of anime series, and sound designer Mitsuru Kashiwabara, who also worked on Doraemon and Space Battleship Yamato. This version of the pilot film was completed in 1969 and shopped around to various distributors and studios. The team had treatments for potential Lupin movies ready to go as well, including one where Lupin begins the film as a hippie wandering Shinjuku City and eventually takes up his mantle as the thief Lupin III. Unfortunately, Tokyo Movie wasn't able to find a buyer who was willing to back a full movie on the project. The prevailing reason, of course, was that studios believed animation wasn't for adults, and unlike more mature anime series, this pilot was considerably explicit with its sex and violence. Even if a distributor was interested in the idea or thought that the pilot was quality stuff, it was certainly a risk. That idea wasn't unfounded, as the rocky performance of Lupin's first broadcast anime outing would later prove that audiences were slow to come to the idea, but that's for another time. Down but not out, Tokyo Movie decided to rework the pilot as a pitch for a TV series. This version featured new voice actors and production members, as some on the team had left Tokyo Movie or moved on to other projects. Notably, Osamu Kobayashi, who later directed Creamy Mami and Kimagori Orange Road, took over the director's chair. Yasuo Otsuka also took over as character designer for some of the redrawn shots. This version also had a rough showing for distributors and was slow to generate traction, but eventually, Yomiuri TV picked up the pilot for a 26-episode series beginning in 1971. By that time, only Yasuo Otsuka and Masaaki Osumi remained on staff at Tokyo Movie, but they were determined to bring a Lupin series to life. And we'll talk about that when I re-release my Part 1 video, but for now, let's actually discuss the pilot film. Before we continue, let's discuss the formatting differences between these two versions. The first version has been dubbed the CinemaScope version due to its use of the CinemaScope lens. The second version was dubbed the 4:3 version since it was reformatted to fit the TV aspect ratio. The basic difference between the two, at least regarding screen resolution, is that the CinemaScope version is presented in widescreen, whereas the 4:3 version is not. CinemaScope was the prevailing film resolution used at the time, whereas almost every TV program used 4:3 or a similar full-screen aspect ratio, as this was far before widescreen became a thing for televisions. Besides the formatting, some shots are redrawn with alternate takes or colored differently in the 4:3 version, and while the two versions have the same basic structure, there is a bit of loose reorganization if you monitor it frame by frame. Not to mention, the voice actors are entirely different, but we'll discuss that in a bit. The plot of the two versions is more or less the same, with minor dialogue and details changed, but nothing that alters the story, so let's run through it real quick. The pilot film is presented as a top-secret official report on Lupin III, beginning with Lupin and Zenigata in a high-stakes shogi battle over the phone. It establishes their intense rivalry and Zenigata's efforts to pursue his arch-enemy, but also how they both enjoy going up against one another. Once Lupin reveals that he's had the upper hand this whole time and Zenigata freaks out, we start to get our first character breakdown on the old inspector. Since this was meant to introduce the cast to a broader audience, it makes sense that we get direct descriptions of their skills and traits. Anyway, Lupin gets both the slip and the last laugh on Inspector Zenigata and goes to celebrate with some alcohol, but Jigen shoots the glass before he can take a sip. He reveals that someone's poisoned his drink, and the two suspect that Fujiko is responsible, and considering she's hiding suspiciously behind the curtains, you'd be wise to think that at first, although she denies responsibility. Lupin then suspects that it's Goemon, who is still, as he was at the beginning of the manga, Lupin's enemy. For the last section, we see that Lupin, Jigen, and Fujiko are barricaded in an old house by the police, including Zenigata and another detective, the fan favorite, Kogoro Akechi. Just kidding, nobody remembers this guy. He shares his name with the fictional detective Kogoro Akechi, created by Edogawa Rampo, who essentially defined the Japanese mystery novel scene with his Boys Detective Club series. The Lupin version of Akechi appeared in the first chapter of the manga, but aside from that and this pilot film, he hasn't made any other appearances. Anyway, the police force themselves in and everyone gets involved in an intense standoff, with plenty of martial arts and gunplay. Goemon then offers to take Lupin down, but thanks to a cleverly disguised dummy, he fails. That's where Akechi comes in to take his shot at bringing Lupin into custody, although, it's actually Lupin, whose clever thinking gives Jigen and Fujiko a means of escaping via kite. It's a simple storyline, all things considered, and if you're at all familiar with Part 1, you'll immediately recognize the latter half of this story as it shares the same finale as Episode 9, albeit with some different details. That episode and this sequence are adapted from the same manga chapter, and considering the tight pacing and character spotlight moments, it's a solid choice. With the same laid-back, carefree, and occasionally pretty machismo attitude from the manga, it was unique among other contemporary anime series, and that, combined with the mature subject matter, made it seem all the more risky for broadcasters. As an introduction to the series, it does its job adequately, albeit with some caveats that are really only noticeable in hindsight. Elements like Goemon being an antagonist makes it clear that this is an early project, as while that was an aspect in the beginning of Part 1, that concept is only rarely ever brought up again. Then there's Kogoro Akechi, a character who, let's be frank, I'm glad didn't carry over. Not that the concept of an older detective working alongside Zenigata is inherently bad, as it works for a lot of the one-off characters in the series, but he doesn't bring anything to the table that would make him stand out as a series regular. But he got the honor of being Lupin's disguise in his only anime appearance, so it could be worse. The animation holds up really well for a project from 1969. Considering it was meant to spawn interest in a film, having high quality animation was undoubtedly important, and a lot of these sequences are really lovely to look at. The sense of speed is fantastic, and the animation and sound design make the action scenes really pop. You might have recognized a lot of shots reused for the opening of Part 1, and many have become classic images in the franchise that have occasionally been replicated elsewhere. One fascinating thing about both versions are the backgrounds. In the CinemaScope version, they're abstract, with thick brushstrokes in the police station as an example. In the 4x3 version, that's replaced with a more standard background, and in my opinion, that loses quite a lot of charm. Let's also look at this scene of Fujiko dancing, which has a really nice painted blue background in the CinemaScope cut. That's been replaced in the 4x3 version with a rapid-fire collage of images, including, but not limited to, flowers, nude women, jazz album covers, Formula 1 race cars, workers in hazmat suits, and a traditional Japanese painting that depicts a couple in coitus. Now, you can interpret the meaning of those images however you want, but it is an exciting collage of both in-the-moment references to world culture and classic artworks and scenes. The art style for the characters seems to more or less copy Monkey Punch's artwork from the manga, with plenty of sharp lines and odd facial proportions that complement the wacky scenarios. Those faces aren't always the best. I think Jigen looks a bit too rubbery, and Fujiko has the same emotionless expression in 75% of these shots. Then you have Goemon's darker skin color, which I assume is done to really highlight his Eastern origins compared to the other characters. Not sure why this didn't carry over to the rest of the series, but hey, it looks fine. Also of note is that Lupin's wearing his red jacket in this pilot, as that was Monkey Punch's preferred jacket color, as you can see from the color artwork he's done of the character over the years. People sometimes like to use the jacket color as a way to signify what kind of adventure we're in for, but as you'll see later down the road, that's not the best way to classify the stories. You really have to look at the characters themselves. Speaking of looking at the characters, why don't we do just that? This pilot film really sells the cool and suave nature of Lupin, emphasizing how he's able to adapt to any situation and keep things under control. Except for the few times, of course, where he doesn't have everything under control, or when he just loses control as shown by his incredible lust. He's voiced in the CinemaScope version by the late Nachi Nozawa, who is perhaps most famous as the dub actor for Al Pacino, Bruce Willis, Robert Redford, and Dustin Hoffman, among many others. While in the 4x3 version, he's voiced by Taichiro Hirokawa, who is also dubbed over Robert Redford alongside Tony Curtis and Roger Moore, and who, funnily enough, portrayed Kogoro Akechi in a few radio series. Now, for the first VAs to lend their voice to our favorite Master Thief, I'm sorry to say that neither of these men really do the role justice. That's probably pretty biased considering the energy and charisma that Yasuo Yamada brought to the role later on, but while these two have a suave and confident tone, it does sound a little strained and nowhere near the craziness that you might expect from the character. Nozawa gets close with Lupin's laughing fit, but it's still not quite there, a little too straight-laced. Next up is Jigen, who is introduced as Lupin's faithful companion and a master sharpshooter. He gets to show off a lot more of his skill, as compared to Lupin, who's firmly on the brain side of the operation this time. He's voiced in both versions by the legendary Kiyoshi Kobayashi, who provided dubs for James Coburn and Lee Marvin, as well as roles in Death Note and the Stardust Crusaders OVA. He's legendary not just for having an excellent voice, but for being the official voice actor for Jigen from this pilot film in 1969 until he officially retired from the role in 2021. That's 53 years he spent with the Lupin franchise, and when you hear him in the pilot film, it's not hard to see why. He nails the rough and gritty voice that fits Jigen to a T, and while he doesn't exactly have much to say in this pilot, it's very easy to see why he became a fan favorite. We'll explore just how well Kobayashi fit the role as we go through the series, but it is a hell of a start for the character. As for Fujiko, she takes up quite a bit of the runtime with this little dance number that's also potentially seizure-inducing, so be mindful if you decide to watch this for yourself. They really emphasize the mystery angle with Fujiko, showing her crashing in on Lupin taking a bath in one scene and then shooting at him the next. Voicing Fujiko across both versions is Eiko Masuyama, who later voiced the character full-time starting with Part 2 in 1977, until she retired from the role in 2011, and who also voiced the titular Honey Kisaragi and Cutie Honey. Masuyama is another voice actor we'll be discussing later on, but she plays this Fujiko very subdued. Masuyama can get very expressive with the character, often to great effect, but she takes a calmer approach this time, which is fitting for the pilot film's cooler and more mature tone. As for Goemon, as I mentioned, he's more of an antagonist this time, as this is evidently before he joins the Lupin crew. In the CinemaScope version, he's played by Goro Naya, who later took up the role of Zenigata instead, and is also known for his voice roles in Kamen Rider and Space Battleship Yamato. You can hear a bit of his voice for Zenigata in this Goemon, albeit more severe and downplayed to match the character. Same goes for Osamu Kobayashi, who voices Goemon in the 4x3 version and who was also the dub actor for Yul Brynner. And this version of Goemon sounds a bit more tired, as if he's playing up a world-weary traveler version of Goemon, which isn't a bad angle, but not the best voice. To round out the regulars, let's talk about Zenigata, who's portrayed as a gruff and passionate detective who's willing to play along with Lupin to the extent that it lets him get closer to catching him, but once he's cornered, he goes all out in trying to bring him to custody. In the CinemaScope version, Zenigata is played by Shinsuke Chikaishi, most well known for his role on Saze-san. And I'm gonna be real, I do not like this Zenigata. It is incredibly high-pitched and screechy and doesn't fit his character in the slightest. Zenigata can get pretty loud as part of his nature, but with a more authoritative voice it conveys a sense of determination, whereas this Zenigata sounds like a bratty teenager. By contrast, he's portrayed in the 4x3 version by Chikao Otsuka, who not only went on to play Goemon in Part 1, but has also played characters like Dr. Eggman, Dick Dastardly, Captain Hook, and Xehanort. In addition, he's also the father of Akio Otsuka, who's a noteworthy voice actor in his own right, and is also the current voice of Jigen. Funny how that comes full circle. Anyway, his Zenigata is pretty decent, firm but not inflexible, and had he continued with the character, it could have been a solid fit overall. And I guess to round it out, I can mention Akechi's voice actors as he's the only other named character we haven't talked about. For the CinemaScope version, he's played by Hitoshi Takagi, who starred as Moomin Papa in the Moomin anime, and was also the dub actor for Yoda in the original Star Wars trilogy. He gives Akechi an air of kookiness that might have made the character stand out more had he been given more time to shine. For the 4x3 version, we've got Koichi Kitamura instead, no relation to the terrorist by the way, who also had roles in Moomin and Tomorrow's Joe, and who was the dub actor for Peter Cushing, as well as having several minor roles throughout the Lupin series. Not much to say about his performance, it's more or less a distinguished older gentleman's voice with no real highlights. Neither version of the pilot film aired publicly at the time, as they were intended as a showcase for potential buyers. Over the years though, they have occasionally been broadcast on Japanese television, and are included as a bonus feature on some Lupin home media releases. As of this video's upload date, the pilot film is available to stream on Amazon Prime, but only in Japan. This version does evidently have the cleanest quality print of the pilot film to date, and both the CinemaScope and 4x3 versions are available. If you live in Japan or can access the Japanese Amazon Prime library, I recommend you check it out. It's also available on the Lupin III Master File Collection, a Japanese exclusive DVD and Blu-ray which, in my opinion, is a pretty great collection for Lupin enthusiasts. This collection contains not just both versions of the pilot film, but also the long-lost pilot episode of Lupin VIII, the pretty great Lupin Family All-Stars short, a 2-minute Lupin CG short released in 2006, and some behind-the-scenes info that is unfortunately Japanese language only. It's worth it just for the additional goodies alone, but if you can't shell out money for an imported copy, you can usually find the pilot film online through less than legal means. If you have to choose one version over the other, I personally prefer the CinemaScope version, not only because it's in the aspect ratio the project was originally intended for, but because the backgrounds and coloring are better. It also avoids some audio issues present on the 4x3 cut, and although not every voice in it really works, looking at you Zenigata, it's the more comprehensive version. That's probably not a fair comparison considering the 4x3 version is literally cut down from the original, but for what it's worth, it isn't a bad way to see Lupin's first animated adventure. Regardless, it's an interesting look at Lupin's anime origins and a really cool curiosity in the series. Definitely not worth checking out until you have some understanding of Lupin III, as it is a bit of an oddball entry with some elements that didn't stick with the franchise. Still, it laid the groundwork for the Lupin anime empire, and for that, it deserves plenty of respect. I just wanted to take some time at the end here to thank all of you for your feedback on these remastered videos. I've drastically changed up the editing style to something that's hopefully easier to watch and still edited enough to avoid any copyright traps. I'm happy to hear any feedback you've got on these videos. As much as I've been working and learning about video editing over the years, I can always improve. On another note, I recently did a collab video with Hoodley where we talk about that Lupin III PS2 game, Treasure of the Sorcerer King. It's a really great video, so if you want to hear us goof around for a bit, you can check that out. The link's in the description. Anyway, I'll see you next time!